All right, there we go. So my name is Nader Dabit. I'm a developer relations engineer at Edge and Node, which is a Web3 blockchain startup that was created in February of this year. So it's a fairly new team. And we focus on continuing building out protocol support for a protocol called the Graph Protocol. We also do venture capital, we do dApp development, and we do a handful of other things. And one of the things that we work on is building out open source and also awareness within the Web3 ecosystem. So one of the things that I've been focusing on a lot is documenting some ideas around what Web3 is and how developers can get started building applications using these technologies and what they're good for and what they're not good for, because they're not good for everything, but they're really great at certain things. So the talk is called Web3 on React, and I want to talk about how developers that are traditionally front-end developers or they are JavaScript or React developers can build out things on this stack and what does this stack look like. So let's talk about what Web3 is to begin with. And this definition is something that you'll hear different people say different things about. So everyone kind of doesn't really have, I would say, the same answer to this question, but really what it comes down to is this idea of the decentralized web and what types of applications you can build on a decentralized stack. And this doesn't replace what we have today, and instead it just opens the door for new types of applications I think that we can build. So you often see now these traditionally quote unquote Web2 companies implementing these crypto / Web3, you could say features. So we now see big companies in the last 6 months like Meta, PayPal, Stripe, Square, Reddit, all these different companies are now starting to add these kind of what we might refer to as Web3 features within their platforms. And then you also have companies that are building out completely decentralized applications that have no centralization. And there's a spectrum of everything in between. So everyone is kind of building out different things, and they fall into this idea of like a spectrum of decentralization. Some people are trying to build out fully decentralized applications. Some people are just kind of like using the building blocks that are available using smart contracts. So when we talk about like Web3, it's starting to become more of a term that people use, but it hasn't really been used that often, I would say, up until the last 6 months or so. But if you look at a lot of the different talks and stuff from some of the people in the Ethereum space, you notice that they've actually been using this terminology for a few years. And they often partition the evolution of the internet into 3 separate categories that are fundamentally different from each other. So the original web that was created that people were starting to get used to from the very beginning was not very friendly to creators. So if you wanted to create something and share and publish it, you were typically a developer and you typically wrote HTML and CSS and some code. But typically, if you were consuming that, you weren't able to interact with it. And then we started having actual applications that were built within the browser that enabled this read, write, and interactive internet that we often partition into Web 2, which is what we're really kind of in today. So if you go to Instagram or YouTube or a blog, you can create something without being a developer. It's this interactive, people are commenting and chatting with each other and creating stuff. And these improvements have been really great. And I think that a lot of the stuff that you're seeing in Web 3, though, is trying to take what we have now and maybe improve that, or kind of take some of the things that are not so great about Web 2 and maybe either fix or improve those. And Web 2 is essentially like, social media like Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, often referred to, as that, blogs, wikis, anything where someone can create and share things without being a developer. So why has the internet become so successful up until this day? Well, there's quite a bit of reasons, quite a few reasons. But one of the reasons that I believe that where we are today is because we have these web protocols that are widely used, and they're not really subject to change. And as a developer, we kind of take these for granted at this point. We are building out applications, and we're kind of all sharing these same protocols all around the world. Things like FTP, TCP, SSH, HTTP. We know that if we build a website on HTTP, that anyone in the world can access it, and we do not have to have a centralized intermediary in order to do so. They're permissionless. So if I launch a site on HTTP, I know that anyone in the world is going to be able to access it. And while we had the ability to use these protocols to build the things that we have today, and essentially what we're doing is we're kind of like creating text files and uploading them and attaching them to addresses, right? And then maybe within those text files, we're linking to other text files. We had a lot of functionality, but there are a couple of pieces of functionality that were not really built in. And therefore, we've built out very complex infrastructure to replace these things. And those things are native payments and native state. So in order to get around this, we have financial architecture and financial systems that are so massively and overly complex, it's hard to actually describe until you actually have looked in depth at how these things work. And I'm not talking about just PayPal or Stripe, but I'm talking about the worldwide financial infrastructure. How does it actually take, or what does it actually take for me to send a payment from my bank account to someone else in a different part of the world? Well, there is a lot involved, and it has to do with not only needing identification and transportation to the bank to set up a bank account in the first place, but also all of these systems need to interop together, and they need to in a really great way. Now, if we live in countries like the United States or Israel, or maybe some of the more developed, quote unquote, developed countries, then we might not actually experience some of the difficulties that other people in the world might experience. But there are a lot of complexities in just sending payments. So essentially what blockchain technology has enabled is this idea of digital scarcity, where we can define what is valuable and what isn't, and we can actually have the ability to kind of like send these payments to each other. So the original version of this might be considered Bitcoin, but now we're seeing a lot more sophisticated versions of these native payments. And the payments or the value is just determined by the market. So you have different tokens that are kind of being created, and people are using them for different reasons. And then we also have this idea of state. So when we want to deal with state today between parties, we need a centralized intermediary to tell us that that data is there, and all of the different things around that data. So we have AWS, GCP, we have all these big cloud providers that allow us to spin up databases. And they're great for certain things, but there are also a lot of trade-offs to all this complexity. In addition to that, they are permissioned. So that means that if I build out an application using this traditional infrastructure, something like Twitter, for example, then my APIs are typically not open for the rest of the world. Now, I can create a couple of APIs and make those available, but there is no guarantee that that API will be available a month or a year from now. So therefore, you can't really use other people's backends as a building block like you can with a smart contract or what we're seeing in Web3. So kind of blockchain technologies have enabled this addition of a couple of different pieces of native functionality that we can now add to our toolkit for building out applications. And they just enable new ways for us to build stuff now that we have the ability to program native payments in native state. So what kind of applications are people building with these additional new building blocks or these new primitives? Well, again, this isn't replacing what we had before. Instead, we're now able to build out new types of applications. So the way I look at it is just how AR, VR, and machine learning and the mobile devices that came along the way open the doors for new platforms and primitives. Blockchain technology does the same thing. It's not replacing, I don't think, what we had before. Instead, it's opening the door for new things that we can build. Most of the times you hear the word decentralized talked about because we're decentralizing this idea of what our centralized web infrastructure was in the past, but we're also decentralizing ownership, not only of the data, but of the platform. Because when I build and deploy a smart contract application, anyone in the entire world can now continue building on that. Not only is that data completely free, open, and public, but the actual back end for people to send transactions to is also completely open and public. So therefore, you see this explosion of DeFi applications that are building on top of each other's smart contracts that are kind of using these primitives, and they're completely permissionless. So if I see a smart contract that I'd like to build a new front end for, then there's no one that is going to stop me from doing that. So we have this idea of shareable backend infrastructure. And then we have this idea of applications being able to compete on interfaces for the same data. So not only if I see a good backend that I want to build on for my company, that I've actually built this backend on, again, anyone in the world can now build on this because all of this is open and public. We introduced this idea of self-sovereign identity. So instead of having a centralized intermediary that holds all of our public data, and then they track all of our movements online, and they attach all of that information together, and then they use that in order to sell advertising for targeting people based on their browsing history and things like that. Web3 is aiming to do away with a lot of this data, I guess you could say the surveillance capitalism type of stuff that we see today, by allowing people to have full control over their identity. So instead of having your data replicated across multiple places, you can choose to either identify yourself based on your address. That is kind of the new way you might identify yourself in Web3 using a wallet address. Or you can have multiple identities using these different wallets. And you have the opportunity to use protocols that allow you to attach real profiles like we've done in the past to these identities. And instead of actually authenticating like OAuth and having the application store your information on their servers, instead you might point them to that identity. And then when you change it in this one place, it kind of gets replicated across all the applications that you're using. And the idea of like having full ownership of your identity is a big part of, I would say, some of the things that Web3 hopes to accomplish. We talked about native digital payments, and I think we talked about most of this other stuff as well. I guess one of the main differences as well is this idea of distributed, trustless, and robust infrastructure. So when we think about a robust infrastructure today, we might think of something like AWS serverless, where we don't have to deal with managing our infrastructure. Instead, the platform offers us a managed service, and all we need to do is invoke our function, and we can assume that that infrastructure will be there and it will not go down. But of course, what we see happen all the time, just like we saw last week, US East goes down. When we have a single point of failure, it's hard to be certain that our application is going to be up and running. A lot of what you see in the Web3 or decentralized space is, instead of having your application running on a single server, you have this decentralized network of nodes that is running your application. And even if 50% of the network goes down, your application should still be running, because it's not relying on a single point of failure. Instead, your data is replicated across all of the nodes in the network, and therefore your application should still be up and running. So what are the types of applications that people are building with these technologies? Well, let's take a look at a few of them. One of the interesting ones that has already become successful today is gaming, in the gaming industry. So when we think of old Web2 types of applications that are popular, that have evolved, maybe that are causing the ideas to evolve to where we are today, I would say, is you think of something like Fortnite, where we have this in-game currency and we have these in-game skins. So if you've ever used or played Fortnite, or your children have, you know that in the past you might have paid $100 for a game. Well, Fortnite was free, but instead of having to pay for the actual game, you end up buying all these digital goods online. The main problem, though, is that even though you have bought all of this in-game currency and skins and all these cool things that you're playing with, once you leave the game, you don't take any of that value with you. All of that money is going to the platform. So the idea that you now see in a lot of these Web3 games is, instead of having all of this value transferred to the platform owner, the value is being retained by the users. So one popular example that is out there right now is this game called Axie Infinity. And Axie Infinity is similar to Fortnite in the sense that you can buy things and you can earn currency within the game, but instead of 100% of that money going to the platform, 4% goes to the platform for running the platform and for providing it, and 95% is retained by the users of the game. So you create or earn money, I guess you could say, within the game tokens. You create and buy these different in-game items, and then when you want to leave the game, you can actually either retain those and take them with you, or do other things with them. But more importantly, you can actually just have a liquid market where you can actually resell them and retain some of that value. So a lot of what you see with this mechanism is changing the way that we think about gaming and providing new incentive mechanisms that we've never really seen before, that are starting to become very, very popular in the gaming industry. So for instance, Axie Infinity, when I took this screenshot in October, had over 2 million daily active users. I don't know what that number is today, but that was at that point. It has over $500 million in transactions in 1 month up until that point as well. You also see the big gaming companies like Ubisoft, Zynga. You have Ryan Wyatt here, who's the head of gaming for YouTube, all kind of like predicting that they think that the future of gaming is going to be implementing a lot of these ideas. Of course, it's not going to be everything, but I think that a lot of what you're seeing in the gaming industry is kind of like realizing that this is a huge opportunity, and you're seeing more and more investment there. So if you look at a lot of the money that's going into these VC firms, they're putting a lot of money towards these types of these games, and I think that we'll see a lot more of this in the next few years. You also have DeFi and stable currencies, which are kind of primitives for building decentralized finance and financial applications. So why would people be interested in this, I guess? Well, stable currencies, as far as those are concerned, you have inflation that we might not experience in certain parts of the world, but other parts of the world, they're a huge problem. So everyone is probably familiar with Venezuela and how terrible that their currency valuation has been. And then, of course, the world is, I guess, experiencing some form of inflation at this point in general, but not nearly as high as a lot of these countries. So essentially, how can we enable a dollar or a token that's pegged to something like the US dollar and have that available to everyone in the world? Well, stable currencies kind of do that. And a lot of people are now wanting and getting paid for their digital work if they are in the Web3 space using digital currencies. You also have this idea of the unbanked. So there are over 1.7 or 1.6 billion people in the world that are unbanked, meaning that they do not have access to a bank account. One of the main reasons has to do with prejudice in different ways. So for instance, in the Global Gender Gap Report of 2020, they found that 72 countries do not allow women from certain social groups to open a bank account, and there were certain countries that just don't allow women to open a bank account, period. In Web3, or if you're working in DeFi, or if you're getting paid in tokens, there is no permission for anyone to do anything. If you have a wallet address and you've done work, then you can get paid. And a lot of the Web3 protocols and a lot of the crypto protocols have large treasuries, and they do these grants programs where people can apply, they can work, and they can get paid without a lot of the red tape and the bureaucracy that we see in the traditional world. But also, you don't have to actually go through the financial hurdles of setting up a bank account and going through all this stuff. You can get paid instantly. And DeFi applications, there are countless of them at this point. You have Curve, which is has over $17 billion in liquidity. You have Uniswap, Aave. There are countless other DeFi applications out there, meaning that not only can you get paid in digital currencies, but you can now also participate in the financial markets and lending and borrowing without the gatekeeping of the traditional finance world. You also see the like Web3ification of certain Web2 applications. So Spotify is a very popular application that has really changed how we think about music. But one of the drawbacks is that a lot of the creators there are not really making a lot of money. In fact, a lot of people kind of look at it as a platform for funneling money to the larger companies that are giving these artists their platforms, and the money that doesn't actually get, a lot of the money doesn't really go to the artists. So Audius is like a Web3 streaming platform that kind of changes how you think about making money as an artist, and it's allowing people to have exponentially more returns per stream using different Web3 tokenomics and I guess you could say incentive mechanisms around how we think about building an application. So Audius is kind of like a Web3 Spotify you could think of. Also blogging, with Audius, there's different ways to earn tokens. So even if you're not an artist, you can create like a trending playlist, and if people actually use that playlist, then you actually earn money that way as well. So you can earn money not only as a creator per se, as an artist, but as a user. And blogging, there's mirror.xyz, which is pretty cool. And it allows writers to earn tokens in different ways. You can actually do crowdfunding directly within the platform. You can sell digital, you can do like crowdfunding, like I mentioned, you can do like tokens and all kinds of stuff. And I think that they've raised tens of millions of dollars, or users have raised, I guess, tens of millions of dollars using the platform. Social media is something that I don't think has been quite figured out yet, but we know how social media works in Web 2. It's kind of based on the exploitation of user data, advertising, and then the user that is on the platform not having ownership. Meaning that if I use Twitter, if I use Facebook or YouTube, and I gain 1 million followers on Twitter or on Facebook, that means that the platform is able to make that much more money off of the traffic that my profile is bringing to the table. But I don't really see any of that. I guess on YouTube, you might be able to sell ads or something like that. But on Twitter, Facebook, and most of these social media platforms, you don't. And even with the ones that do share, it's not really a large portion of what the income that's being brought in through advertising. But also advertising is just a bad user experience. I know that if I use YouTube these days, I spend a large portion of my time just skipping through ads. So social media and Web3 tries to flip the idea of how we think about incentivizing and, I guess you could say, paying people that are part of the platform, and moving away from this idea of advertising into new ideas that we'll look at that have to do with tokenization. So Web 2 platforms, again, they don't often have ways for people to kind of make any money beyond kind of like just a small amount, you could say, I guess you could say, unless you have like tens of millions or hundreds of millions of followers. But you're starting to see some really interesting things in Web3 around paying people not only for creating, but actually just using the platform. So Super Rare is an NFT digital marketplace that was created. And if you used Super Rare as a creator or even as a user for the first X number of months that they were around, they eventually launched a token, and they decided to then airdrop tokens to anyone who had used the platform. So if you had just used Super Rare, you would have been airdropped anywhere between a few thousand to up to over $100,000 US worth of tokens once their token launched. And this was kind of their way of giving back to the people that had kind of supported them early on, and maybe using some of the liquidity that they had to kind of share that with the people that had helped build them. So again, you have this idea of sharing ownership, and this is kind of like one example of that. Another example is Gitcoin, where you had Gitcoin had launched their own token, and they gave away over $100 million to all of their users. Recently, we also saw ENS, which is Ethereum naming service. It's almost like a DNS name, but for Ethereum. Anyone that had claimed an ENS name got airdropped anywhere between like $3 to maybe $40 or $50,000. You see this idea of like sharing ownership in general, like being a big thing. You also see that people are taking this idea of the incentive structures that are around NFTs and using them for different ways, and the ones that I like the most are for public goods. So for instance, this Japanese artist and JavaScript developer created a 10,000 piece NFT generative art launch, and he generated over $3 million in sales in just a few minutes actually. And his generative art was created using something called p5.js and 432 lines of JavaScript. And using this launch, he took all this money and he actually gave it back to the generative art community that had helped him kind of become successful in his own career. So he was able to raise over $3 million in this launch. So why would people not instead just donate money maybe to these causes instead of using like an NFT launch? Well, I think that the idea of providing this new incentive mechanism where when someone is handing over money, they're given something in return that retains value, then it means a lot. So if you participated in this launch and you kind of bought one of these, the value is still retained, and it kind of course, fluctuates. It goes up and down. But at one point, it would be worth like, a few X worth of what you paid for it to begin with. Also, whenever someone sells one of these on the open market, it also takes a percentage of that and gives it back. So he's essentially kind of built this this revenue for the JavaScript and generative art community that is based on an NFT, which is pretty cool. So I think it might take some of these. I think Web3 social media might kind of combine a few of these ideas, and we'll see something at one point, but we don't really have a good example of what that looks like. I don't think quite yet. You do see though that a lot of the people in the Web2 space are thinking about this. So for instance, Jack from previous CEO of Twitter decided to launch this idea of Blue Sky. It's kind of a decentralized Twitter. They're still working on it, but they've been working on it now for a couple of years. And you start seeing more and more talking about Blue Sky in the last couple of months. I think a lot has to do with the more awareness, I guess, of like Web3 and decentralization and stuff. You also have different Web3 companies that are also thinking about building out their own versions of social media. So this is one of the founders of Aave, and they want to build out kind of like a decentralized Twitter. And then there's probably a dozen other different teams that are also building out various social media platforms on Web3. Will be interesting to keep up with this and see what happens, but I don't think we have a winner yet, or even like a good example yet. So what are the types of applications? Well, I kind of went over some, but these are the categories that I think that are most interesting to me. We have DeFi and stable currencies, and using those as primitives to build out different financial applications. We have decentralized and serverless web infrastructure protocols, which I'll show in just a moment. We have play to earn gaming, which I kind of showed some examples of in just a second ago. We have decentralized autonomous organizations, which I'm not going to really go into at this moment, but they are ways to tokenize communities is essentially what you could think of. We have digital art, which are also known as NFTs. We have tokenization of physical assets like real estate. This is still fairly early on, but this is I think this is going to be probably one of the biggest pieces of what the future of Web3 probably looks like, or the future of crypto. We haven't seen a lot of the tokenization of real world items because I think figuring out how to make this work at scale is something that's not easy, but I think that's going to be something we see a lot more of in the future. And then we just start seeing the Web3 application of typical Web2 applications. So like I showed earlier, Audius is an example of that, Mirror, the blogging platform, and then I think we'll see social media, etc. So how do we actually build out these applications? Well, I mentioned this idea of trustless, distributed, serverless, robust infrastructure. So these are essentially Web3 infrastructure protocols like the one that I work on at The Graph. It looks like my time is up, so I need to go ahead and wrap this up. Yeah, so I'm going to be wrapping this up, and I'm a little bit over on time. But The Graph is a protocol that allows developers to build applications using blockchain data. So in the traditional world, we have databases that are optimized for reading and writing data. But in the blockchain world, you have this idea of these blocks that are kind of written over the course of days, weeks, months, and years. And it's easy to write data to these, but it's not easy to read data. So the graph is kind of this web infrastructure protocol that allows developers to deploy GraphQL APIs that index and serve their data up in a GraphQL endpoint. So you also have different other protocols. So for peer-to-peer data or off-chain data, Ceramic Network, for live streaming, live peer, for file storage, something like AWS S3, you have RWeave and IPFS. For Git, decentralized GitHub, I guess you could say, would be Radical. And then identity would be something like a wallet. And then also for managing your decentralized identity, there's a protocol called IDX. So really the Web3 stack is essentially these different building blocks that we had before. But in addition to that, we also have smart contracts. And we're thinking about building this infrastructure using decentralized protocols. So building a dApp, building an app like this using React, what would that look like? Well, essentially you want to choose the blockchain that you want to work with. I typically use the EVM or the Ethereum virtual machine because you learn this one stack and you can build on dozens of different blockchains. So it's kind of like the React, I think, of blockchain, where you can learn once and write anywhere. So you might pick up this basic stack to kind of get started. Your client framework might be Next.js. Your Ethereum development environment might be something like Hardhat. You have a client library, like you might think of Fetch or Axios. In the Web3 world, it might be Ethers. And then you have a wallet for identity, MetaMask. If you want to get started building, I would check out Scaffold ETH, which is a boilerplate that has dozens of different, or even hundreds of different example projects, full stack. I would also check out Anchor, which is a framework for building on Solana. Check out my guide, the complete guide to full stack Ethereum development that shows how to build this with React. And I'm over on time, so I'm gonna not do my demo, but that's it. So thank you for checking this out. And if you wanna learn more, follow me on Twitter and also check out that guide, complete guide to full stack Ethereum development. Thank you.